Good morning, sixth grade. Oh, looks like my screen doesn't want to focus. Let's get that in focus. All right, we're on chapter 29. So remember, he has the elucidator now, and he's refusing to give it back to JB. Angela, JB called, the taser. Instantly, Jonah saw his mistake. In a second, Angela would turn around and aim her taser at him, and they'd just reenact the scene from a moment ago. Except this time it would be Jonah writhing on the floor and passing out, and JB scooping up the fallen elucidator. And then what would happen next? Jonah didn't know, but he could still hear Mr. Hodges' words echoing in his brain. I can't believe they think you're on their side. You must not have told them what you want to do. What did it mean? What should Jonah do? Was there anyone he was sure he could trust? That was one question he could answer. Catherine, he called, catch. He tossed the elucidator in the air, an easy toss, easier than passing a basketball. He knew without turning to look at Catherine that Catherine would catch it, that she would hold on tightly, that she wouldn't betray him. He might make fun of it. She might make fun of him. She might roll her eyes and call him an idiot, but she wouldn't let go. She'd already proved that. As soon as the elucidator was in the air, Jonah took off running. JB made no attempt to stop him because he was spinning around following the arc of the elucidator. So Jonah had a clean, fast sprint to the back of the cave. He needed the speed. He needed the element of surprise. If he had any prayer of wrestling the taser out of Angela's hand before she aimed it at him. But he was too late. Even in the dimness of the back of the cave, Jonah could see that Angela had already turned around. In one smooth, quick move, she pulled a cartridge from her pocket, reloaded the taser, and pointed it back toward Jonah. Jonah took a stumbling step to the side just in case he had a chance of dodging the taser light and the barbs and whatever else the taser was about to send zinging at him. He hoped it wouldn't hurt too badly. He hoped he wouldn't scream as loudly as Gary and Mr. Hodge had. He hoped. Angela held the taser steady, aiming past Jonah, aiming toward Mr. Hodge and Gary. Shoot, Jonah, JB was yelling helpfully. Thanks a lot, Jonah thought. He didn't have any hope now. He was too close to Angela, too close to reverse his course, too close for her to miss. Just as soon as she corrected her arm and squeezed the trigger, he'd be on the ground. Angela spun toward Jonah, but she didn't squeeze the trigger. She stepped forward and glanced out toward the brighter part of the cave, though that made no sense. Surely Jonah was blocking her view. She turned the taser sideways, not pointing it at anyone anymore. Then she reached over and slid the taser into Jonah's grasp. She was handing over her weapon. What? Jonah demanded, dumbfounded. Angela pressed a finger to her lips, and then she moved the finger and began to scream. No, you can't have it! Jonah's ears were reverberating with all the lung power released in such a small space. But Angela was expecting him to listen. She leaned in close and whispered in her ear, I'm really on your side, completely. You deserve to know the truth, so pretend that you captured me. Jonah just stood there. He was so stunned, he almost dropped the taser. Maybe you should just shout something about getting the ropes, Angela whispered, bending down to pick up looped coils from the floor of the cave. Move it! Get those ropes now, Jonah hollered. His voice cracked. Surely that wasn't a convincing yell. But Jonah could hear JB calling from the lighter part of the cave. Angela, what happened? Before breaking off to warn Catherine. Young lady, really, you can't press any of those buttons. You don't know what they do. What's going on? Jonah hissed at Angela. Tell me. There isn't time to talk. Besides, you should hear it from the experts, not me, she nudged him. Go on. Jonah started to back out of the darkness. Ahem, Angela said. She stepped in front of him and moved her hand over his so that the end of the taser was pressed into her ribcage. Don't you dare set that off now. You're too close, she whispered. But please make it look like it's possible that you captured me. Angela, JB called again, sounding even more worried. Angela dropped her hand from the taser. Together, Jonah and Angela stepped out into the light. He got your weapon, JB said incredulously. He overpowered you? He's a very strong young man, Angela said defensively. Stronger than he looks. Well, that was an insult, wasn't it? Jonah dug the taser more deeply into Angela's ribs. He shoved her forward more roughly than he'd intended. Maybe not quite so realistic, she muttered. Give the ropes to Chip, Jonah ordered. Jonah, I'm not a Boy Scout, Jonah said. My dad said he didn't have time for all those campouts, so I don't know anything about tying knots. And here, Jonah said, slapping the taser into Chip's hand. Shoot her if you have to. Anguish spread over Angela's face. Jonah could tell she wasn't acting now, either, because it was Chip holding the taser, and there was no way Jonah could signal Chip to let him know she was really on their side without JB seeing as well. Jonah tied Mr. Hodges and Gary's wrists and ankles. They lay calmly now, their eyes half closed. Jonah couldn't tell if they were dazed or if they were faking it, biding their time. He tied the knots as quickly as he could. He walked toward JB, rope still dangling from his hands. Not me too, JB asked with now that's a word I don't know. Ingratiating. There we go. Ingratiating grin. I think you've gotten confused. Maybe I was the one that was trying to save all of you. So that's kind of like ingrateful, ingratiating grin. Remember, I was the one trying to save all of you? What were you saving us from? Jonah asked in a dull voice. What were you saving us for? Tell your sister to give me the elucidator and I'll explain, JB said. Explain and maybe we'll decide you deserve the elucidator, Jonah said. He looped the rope around JB's wrist and tied his firmest knot yet. JB didn't resist. But Jonah tied JB's ankles and Angela's ankles and wrists. Someone was sniffling behind them. Oh, please. It was Ming, the girl who'd temporarily been a human shield. Just open the door and let us go to our parents. My cell phone isn't working. I've been trying to call the police. Once we're out of the cave, I'm sure it'll work, right? Jonah hadn't even thought about cell phones, but now he noticed that just about every kid had one out. One boy near the back bench was stabbing a finger at his phone 3 times, waiting, stabbing 3 times again, waiting. 911, Jonah thought. Of course. His knees almost gave way at the thought of a bunch of police officers in dark uniforms would soon come swarming into the cave, saving them all, saving Jonah from having to make any more choices, any more mistakes. And then Jonah realized that the reason the boy kept stabbing at the phone was that none of his calls were going through. Sure, he told Ming, you find a way to open the door and we'll be out of here. No, don't, JB shouted. Oh, let them try, Gary said groggily from the ground. There's a keypad by the entryway. The code is 21ST. Is it a trick? Jonah turned back to JB. What will happen if we try that code? If we open the door, he demanded. You'll see. You'll find out. Too much all at once, JB said. Might scare you. It might scare you after everything that's already happened. JB worried about scaring us. Jonah decided to take his chances. He rushed toward the entryway as if he'd become the Pied Piper now. Most of the other kids shoved in behind him. His finger shook as he pressed in 21 and then ST. An image was growing in his mind of what he might see when the door slid back. Maybe, somehow, Gary and Mr. Hodge had already slipped them into the future. They'd step out of the cave, and all of the trees would be gone. The newly built houses would be ancient and falling down. That would be scary, but Jonah was braced for it. He began moving slowly this time. The door began moving slowly this time, like it was an ancient boulder, covered with 1,000 years of moss. As soon as there was a crack between the door and the wall, Jonah darted toward it, peeking out. He peeked out and saw nothing. He peeked out and saw nothing. Why do you think he saw nothing? Okay, we're going to go on to chapter 30. Beyond him, other kids began to scream in terror, but Jonah could only stare. It wasn't dark beyond the cave door. Darkness would be something. Darkness would mean that with a little light, there'd be plenty to see. Darkness would be comforting, actually. This was much worse. There was just enough light filtering out from the cave to show that there were no trees anymore, no houses, no path, no rocks, no clouds, no sky. Nothing. It was like being deep in outer space, so far away from everything else that he couldn't even see any stars. We're in a black hole, someone screamed behind him. Automatically, instinctively, Jonah hit the keypad again, 21ST. He hoped it was like the garage door opener at home, where the same code worked for opening and closing. Mercifully, the door began to roll shut again. It's not a black hole, another kid was explaining, sounding perfectly rational. In a black hole, the gravity would crush us. It reminds me of the Bible, a girl said thoughtfully. Genesis. The earth was without form and void. Jonah grabbed the not a black hole boy and the girl who thought of the Bible and pulled them through the crowd. He wanted people by his side who could think when everyone else was screaming. He walked back to the adults, who were all sitting on the floor now with their backs against the wall, Chip and Catherine pointing the taser and the elucidator at them, Gary and Mr. Hodge looking amused, JB and Angela looking distressed. Explain, Jonah demanded. Where are we? The more appropriate question, Mr. Hodge said teasingly, would be, when are we? JB kicked at him with both legs at once, since JB's legs were tied together. Don't be cruel, JB said. This is bound to be very traumatic for all of them. He looked over at the screaming, hysterical mass of kids clustered by the door, then back at Jonah. We call this a time hollow. When they shut the door, Hodge and Gary pulled this whole cave outside of time. So what? Like, we don't even exist right now? The not black hole kid asked. Jonah glanced at him more closely now. He had curly blonde hair, kind of like Chip's. His name tag said Alex. No, JB said, we exist, but now doesn't. Why not? The girl said. Her name tag said Emily. JB glanced toward the hysterical crowd once more. Get them calmed down, he said. Make them sit on the benches again. Hodge and Gary and I will explain everything. We will, Gary growled. I will, JB said, and it's fine with me if they only hear my version. We'll explain too, Hodge muttered. It took forever to get all the kids back to the benches, to get them to be quiet. Jonah thought he and Emily and Alex had accomplished it when one kid happened to glance at his cell phone. It still says 10:18, he screamed. It said 10:18 since we've got here. Shh, shh, Emily soothed him. Sometimes cell phones break. She sat beside him holding his hand, and that seemed to calm him down. Catherine, Chip, and a few other kids had worked to pull the adults to the front of the room. They stood like dangerous prisoners on trial, Catherine and Chip guarding them from the side. Just show them the presentation, Hodge was suggesting. You mean your commercial? JB sneered. No way. You can give the counterpoint afterward, JB said. We promise. Let them, Angela said. You showed it to me. JB frowned and then shrugged. All right, he said. Go into demo mode on the elucidator, sugar, Hodge told Catherine. See the demo button at the top? Catherine glared, offended by the sugar, but she seemed to be following his orders. Let me guess, she said, the one that says adoption promo? You got it, Hodge said. Now, aim it to the wall. Instantly, on the front wall of the cave, a movie screen appeared. No, Jonah went over and touched it. It was still solid rock. No light shone from the elucidator, but it was clearly the source of both the screen and the images that suddenly glowed from the screen. Shifting photographs of hundreds of faces, seeming to represent every era of culture and history. Despite the rock surface, the faces were clear and unruffled. This was beyond high definition. It was like watching reality. From the time humankind achieved time travel, a voice boomed out, just like a movie preview, people have been stirred with compassion for the sufferings of the past. What followed was a montage, a collection of images that Jonah could barely stand to watch. People lost their heads to guillotines. Soldiers on horseback ran swords through infants. Bodies fell into pits, dug to bury the living with the dead. It went on, agonizingly. Jonah felt like he'd seen all the worst moments of human history by the time the killings finally ended. I'm not allowed to watch R-rated movies, a kid behind Jonah screamed. Make it stop! Shh, it's over now, a girl's voice comforted. It's in the past, Jonah looked back. It was Emily again. On the screen now, all the death and destruction was replaced by a grim-faced man sitting in what appeared to be a TV studio. A caption at the bottom of the screen identified him as Curtis Rathbone, CEO, Interchronological Rescue. The past was a very brutal place, he intoned solemnly. But as much as modern humanity's hearts went out to their ancestors, their antecedents, they knew that the paradox and the ripple would make intervention very difficult. Pause it for a moment, will you? JB called out. I think you need a few definitions. Yeah, there were some tough words in there, so let's hear what JB's got to say. Catherine squinted at the elucidator. Where is it? Wait, yeah, I got it. Curtis Rathbone, CEO, froze on the screen. The paradox, JB called out. That's the possibility that time travelers might cause some event in the past that would lead to their own non-existence. So think about that. You cause an event in the past that would lead to their own non-existence, such as, for instance, accidentally killing their own parents. Then they would never be born. And the ripple is what we call any significant change caused by time travelers, which then alters the present and the future. Think of a stone thrown into a pond and the way the ripples spread out to the very edge of the water. Is that clear? Does everyone understand? Jonah expected the other kids to begin shouting out, time travel? What are you talking about? Are you nuts? Or the ripple, the paradox? Yeah, right. Try the psych ward. But when he looked around, the faces around them were as solemn as Curtis Rathbone. So solemn meaning like glum or serious. The other kids had seen the nothingness outside the cave, and they were ready for explanations, however far-fetched. Okay, back to the propaganda, JB said. On the screen, Curtis Rathbone began talking again. We here at Interchronological Rescue were determined to take action, he said. We studied time very carefully, centuries worth of wars, genocide, famines, pestilence, all the very worst of human suffering. And we discovered hundreds whose deaths were so horrendous, so chaotic, so terrible, we knew we had to save them. And we knew we could. Someone gasped behind Jonah. That's right, Curtis Rathbone said, almost as if he had heard that gasp. Rescue was possible. Oh, we knew we couldn't save everyone. Much as we would have liked to save, say, every victim of the 20th century European Holocaust, we knew that was off limits. The ripple would have been extreme. Too much happened as a result of the Holocaust. But to save even the small, insignificant victims of the past, the orphans of history, as if it were, didn't our own humanity demand that we try? A single tear glistened in Curtis Rathbone's eye. He dabbed at it and smiled fleetingly out of the screen. So we began 10 years ago, rescuing children of the Spanish Inquisition. He said babies left in houses that were then burned to the ground, children left for dead who were easily revived by our modern techniques. We could save them without causing a ripple or a paradox, because they had as good as vanished from history, even without our intervention. And thus, we could transform those dark days of humanity into a triumph of the human spirit, of modern humanitarianism. Now, he beamed out at the crowd, the terrors of history receding into the past. The response of the modern age has been overwhelming, Rathbone continued. Everyone was eager to adopt a desperate child from the past, to reach out across the centuries, to save some poor soul who had never had a chance. Within 5 years, we were running 10 rescue missions a week in every century since the beginning of time. Our generous age paid for plastic surgery for Neanderthals, so those are the cavemen, landmine victims, counseling for war refugees, reconstructive surgery for landmine victims. And then we perfected our age reversal techniques. So the children we rescued didn't even have to remember their ordeals. We could deliver perfect, happy, healthy, bouncing babies to our clients. That's enough, JB snarled. Turn it off. Catherine must have managed to hit the right buttons because Curtis Rathbone disappeared from sight. Maybe it was Jonah's imagination, but the lights in the room seemed to be a bit brighter as well. So it sounds to me, I'm going to pause for a moment and just talk. It sounds to me that Curtis Rathbone is saying that what they were doing was going back in time and rescuing babies young children and babies that had died because of horrendous acts in history, bad things that had happened to them. And these babies never had children, so there was no ripple effect. There was nobody that it would affect by changing their way into the future. So they would bring them back now to the present, which is the modern, actually the future in this situation. They would help them with their injuries, give them surgeries, and then adopt them out to people. So it sounds like a rescue mission. They go back in time and they save these babies that were horrendously hurt or killed. Now, JB seems to be thinking it's not so simple, so he's arguing. Perhaps Curtis Rathbone had humanitarian intentions in the beginning, JB growled. Perhaps. He did, Hodge shouted. He does. JB ignored him. But what interchronological rescue became was something entirely different, he said bitterly. Purveyors of prestigious names from history, from wealthy idiots who want to brag at their cocktail parties. Oh, yes, my little Henry comes from a line of British kings. Didn't you try to kidnap Amelia Earhart out of the skies over the Pacific? Didn't you lure Ambrose Bierce to the Mexican border? The age reversal doesn't work on adults, Gary muttered. You know that now, JB countered. Hold on, Jonah said, because no one else was speaking up. Age reversal? JB flashed him an angry glance. He turned his glare back to Hodge. Traumatized children from traumatic times in history have a lot of issues, JB said sarcastically. There were problems interchronological rescues would never want to talk about, never wanted the prospective adoptive parents to know about. Erase the memories and you erase the problems, Hodge said cheerily. What's wrong with that? Jonah stared at Hodge, trying to understand. This is one of the few parts of the theory I was right about. Angela spoke up apologetically. They had turned you all into babies again, even though some of you had been much older, teenagers even. Angela's words seemed to echo in the stone room. Turned you all into babies again. Watching JB's outrage, Jonah had almost forgotten that any of this time travel talk had even had anything to do with him. Us? He whispered. You're talking about us? JB was still glaring at Hodge and Gary. Interchronological rescue got sloppy, he accused. They began taking children whose disappearances were noticed. They caused ripple upon ripple upon ripple. He closed his eyes, pained beyond words. Oh, and your intervention worked so well, Hodge accused. We could have repaired the ripples. We could have put a few children back if we had to, but no! You and your friends insisted on attacking right in the middle of the time stream. The time crash was not my fault, JB screamed. If you just surrendered, you're the one who chose to speed away, to slam into the time frame, to ruin her life. He pointed at Angela. To destroy 13 years of mine. No, to destroy all of time. Even tied up, they were about to come to blows again. Jonah had had it. He had had it with the suspense, the implications, the accusations, the strain. He stood up. That was enough. He climbed up on top of a bench and yelled, "Who are we?" JP and Hodge both fell silent. Then JP said, "Show them. They're going to find out eventually." The F6 on the elucidator, Hodge said. Jonah watched. His sister hit a button. The screen reappeared, displaying a chart. It was a seating chart, Jonah realized, like for a classroom. On an airplane. He stepped down from the bench to get a closer look, and he squinted at the names. Seat 1A, Virginia Dare. 1B, Edward V. of England. 1C, Richard of Shrewsbury. His eyes skimmed down the list, looking for boys' names or names that sounded familiar. 9B, John Hudson. 10C, Henry Fountain. 11A, Anastasia Romanoff. 12B, Alexis Romanoff. 12C, Charles Lindbergh III. That's who you are, JB said quietly. You're the missing children of history. Okay? So take a look and pause at some of these names. And I encourage you right now to Google them. To Google Anastasia Romanoff. Alexis Romanoff, Charles Lindbergh III, Henry Fountain, John Hudson. Are they real? Were they real? What does he mean by you are the missing children of history? Okay. In fact, I'm going to put these names, list them out for you in a doc if you so choose to Google them. I encourage you to. And then when we come back to class tomorrow, we will talk about what did you discover? What did you discover when you Googled those names? There will not be questions today. There will not be a form. Your job today, actually, maybe I will make it a form. I'll do that. I'll make it a form with the names. And you're to go and Google and see what you can find out about some of these missing children of history. It's getting good, kids, getting good.